Right, so as you might well be aware, representations to the International Court of Justice have continued from a multitude of different sources, different nations over the last several days against Israel over its ongoing genocide in Gaza. If you thought that South Africa's ruling was the be-all and end-all of this right now, far from it. But amongst all the testimonies that have been made, many powerful, many hard-hitting, the one that has stood out for many was the presentation given by Professor Ralph Wilde, an expert in international humanitarian law from University College London, who spoke at the ICJ representing the Arab League of Nations, a collective of nations spanning the Middle East and North Africa, because it's possibly the most subtly damning destruction of every excuse Israel have made to be doing what they're doing in the most clever, most astonishing way you will have ever heard. Right, so the Arab League presentation to the International Court of Justice has been one of the real highlights of recent days, the ongoing court cases in the ICJ, with every excuse, every attempted justification by Israel of what they are doing absolutely eviscerated. And on top of that, exposes the reality of what the Zionist settler colonialist mentality in Palestine is and was all about. And actually, I had my mind absolutely blown by it, because there is so much I either hadn't put two and two together on or simply never knew that Wilde brought up in his presentation. Professor Ralph Wilde began by referring to the creation of Israel as a denial of the Palestinian right to legal self-determination as a result of a century-long, violent, colonial, racist effort to establish a nation-state exclusively for the Jewish people. When you start things off that way, well, it's pretty hard to ignore what is being said. And your ears do kind of prick up to what is coming next, because you're thinking, hello, this is a little bit of a different approach, even when it is spoken as quietly and evenly as Wilde did throughout his entire presentation. And Wilde spoke of Zionism being forcibly implemented following World War I, altering the demographic context of the region, softening the area up in effect to have a stronger case to establish a Jewish state in the region. So many of us, we think of 1948 and the Nakba as being the forced displacement of Palestinians to make room for Jewish colonialists to move in and take over even further beyond the establishment of the State of Israel. But actually that skips over what happened in the previous few decades, where Palestinians were already being forced out for Jewish settlers, to the point that the population of Palestine was 11% Jewish just after World War I. Non-Jewish Palestinians got displaced, and were being displaced even then, and that was regardless of their own direct personal links to the areas they were being moved from. Of course, we hear all the time that Israel belongs to the Jewish people. There is no Palestine, they say. Yet here we are, going back a little over 100 years, and the displacement of Palestinians, 90% of the population, was already happening. And Jewish people at that point could hardly say they have this right to the land then, because what was happening was basically blatant white privilege. Palestinians were moved on for Jewish settlers. No right of return. Everything we, by and large, who are interested and horrified in equal measure by what is happening in Gaza now, who have read some history, look at the 5 times Israel and surrounding Arab nations, including Palestine, have gone to war with each other since Israel was formed. Well, we in the West are not well educated on these matters, figuring everything began with that formation of Israel and the Nakba that followed, and that simply isn't true, because it goes back before then, to when Palestine was still British controlled, and how badly this country actually shafted the Palestinian people for the sake of the Jewish people, and even now we're still doing it despite the mess doing that has created out there. So we're post-World War I, the Treaty of Versailles has been signed, the war was over. Forming part of that treaty was something called the Covenant of the League of Nations, and Professor Wilde drew particular attention to Article 22 of this covenant, which is lengthy in and of itself, and I won't go into it all, but the first bit of it reads, "To those colonies and territories which, as a consequence of the late war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility, and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League." So effectively, because Palestine was British controlled, it fell under the classification of one of these colonies aforementioned in Article 22. British controlled as Palestine was, and unable to support itself at that time. Therefore, Britain was obligated to help it stand on its own 2 feet. But we didn't do that. As Professor Wilde explains, Palestine should have had its recognition as an independent state provisionally recognised during that time. But instead, the UK and other League Covenant signatories sought to incorporate the 1917 Balfour Declaration into it, the right for Jewish people to have a state of their own, into that same right for Palestinian self-determination. The thing is, that was completely illegal. There was literally no legal basis whatsoever that this could and should have been undertaken. They had no mandate for that. They had no legal power to do any of it. Yet they went ahead anyway. Now, I found this darkly hilarious because it means the state of Israel is entirely built on a lie, built on illegalities and abuses of law, and despite their claims to have some divine right to the land they occupy, legally they have no right to it whatsoever. The UK and others who supported them broke the law on this. It's something that Wilde called acting ultra vires, these Latin phrases that perpetuate legal speak, but that basically means beyond the powers, having done something that requires legal authority, but was done without it. I mean, there are ways of starting an argument to blow away all manner of Israeli excuses for their actions, but demonstrating in a court of law, the world court at that Israel don't actually have any right to exist built on any legal basis, and pointing out exactly why this is, just drives a monster truck clean over every excuse they come out with. Because at the end of the day, if Israel have no right to exist, they have no rights at all. Israel is a nation built without legal foundation. And I just find that incredible. We refer to the crisis in the Middle East as a 75-year-long war of attrition, but it's more like a 100-year-long legal cover-up. That has seen an entire people persecuted by an imperial colonial mindset. The British Empire still alive and kicking in Palestine, in effect. That's Zionism, folks, maintaining the cover-up since 1919. It gets even worse, though. Following World War II, a new right to self-determination for colonial peoples came into existence, which was supplementary to the League Covenant. However, by 1947, a proposal to create a state for the Jewish people and partition Palestine was proposed, and of course in 1948 came to fruition as the State of Israel came into being. By 1948, the Jewish population of Palestine, incidentally, had risen to some 75% of the population. So the colonialists who had no legal right to be there had been doing some serious colonising, now so far outweighing the Palestinian people that, of course, this was going to go ahead. Again, for the second time, legal protections, legal rights were ignored. And of course what happened then was a fight back which was lost, not least due to Western support for the newly minted Israel, which led to the Nakba. And even more displacement of more Palestinians with no right to return. Twice over, Palestinian rights to self-determination, to exist in light of global events outside their control, led to them being shafted, shunned and excluded, persecuted. The UN admitted Israel as a member, all in defiance of Palestine's legal right to exist, and Israel lacking any legal basis to. I am genuinely astounded that this was even possible. I'm astounded at the testimony of Professor Wilde giving this explanation as to why Israel in fact has no legal right to be. It is only now, in a court of law, taking in all of Israel's crimes since its inception and the crimes of Zionism before that much of this is coming to light, and it's one hell of a history lesson. Nothing Israel say they have this right to or that right to counts for anything when they, as an entity, they as a nation, lack any legal basis to exist, unlike the Palestinians. As Professor Wilde stated following this explanation, Israel is not the legal continuation or successor of the mandate. This violation of Palestinian self-determination is ongoing and unresolved. Two key elements are, first, Palestinian people not displaced from the land proclaimed to be of Israel in 1948, and their descendants are being forced to live as citizens. Presently they constitute 17.2% of a state conceived to be of and for another racial group, under the domination of that group, necessarily treated as second class because of their race. And second, Palestinian people displaced from that land and their descendants cannot return. These are serious breaches of the right of self-determination, the prohibitions of racial discrimination and apartheid, and the right of return. They must end immediately. Those 2 points are really important, because for anyone who figures the Nakba happened in 1948, it simply started then. It has continued and still continues to this day. We also appear to have a few more ways of describing Israel now, it would seem. The illegal state of Israel, perhaps. The land proclaimed to be of Israel. I quite like that, quite flowery. The stolen land of Palestine, maybe. I'm sure you can come up with some more and varied variations. But yes, Israel doesn't have a legal basis to be, it would appear. Professor Wilde's full presentation is on YouTube as well. The We Love Africa channel have it. All 26 minutes of it. And I really do suggest you watch the whole of it, because this entire video has been based on just the first 6 minutes. He went on so much further and into so much more that I could sit here for an hour literally going over what this guy said, than what the little bit I've spoken about here saved to make the video too long. This is what I mean by Israel being so well and truly done for now, so totally and momentously screwed. And the full presentation is well worth watching, as this theme of Israel's lack of a right to exist undermines everything they have said and done since, through the 1967 Six-Day War, the occupation of the remaining Palestinian territories, and more. This ought to put into context further the UN's urging to end arms sales to Israel. A fair question is, why would any country be arming a nation which has no legal basis to exist in order to defend itself, allegedly, but in actual fact is being done to attack a nation which actually does very much have a legal basis to exist? More on that story in this video recommendation here, and I hopefully will catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.